My girlfriend's father threatened to cut her off. She called his bluff and walked away. Simone and I met in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning. My younger sister had been in a car accident, and I'd driven 2 hours from my construction job site to get there, still covered in drywall dust and paint. Simone was there because her grandmother had fallen and broken her hip. We sat in adjacent plastic chairs while nurses moved through the halls and machines beeped behind closed doors. She offered me half of her granola bar because the vending machines were empty and I looked like I hadn't eaten. I took it and told her my sister was going to be fine, but the waiting was torture. She said her grandmother was 92 and stubborn as hell, that she'd probably outlive everyone. We talked until dawn when our respective family members were moved to recovery rooms, and I asked for her number before we left. She wrote it on a coffee cup sleeve and told me to actually use it, not just keep it as a souvenir. I called her the next day. Our first date was at a diner near the hospital because neither of us had slept much, and we both needed food that wasn't from a vending machine. Simone showed up in jeans and a sweater that had paint stains on the sleeve, and she explained she'd been helping her grandmother repaint the guest room before the fall happened. I told her I worked construction, and we compared paint color opinions for 20 minutes before ordering. She asked what I built, and I explained I was a project manager for a residential construction company, mostly custom homes and renovations. She said that sounded interesting and asked if I liked it. I told her I loved it, that there was something satisfying about watching empty lots transform into places where families would make memories. She smiled and said she worked in interior design but was thinking about going back to school for architecture. We talked for 3 hours and closed down the diner, and when I walked her to her car, she kissed me first. We dated for 5 months before I met her family. Simone kept putting it off, and when I asked why, she'd change the subject or say her parents were traveling. Finally, she admitted her father was difficult about boyfriends, and she wanted to make sure we were serious before introducing me. I asked what she meant by difficult, and she said he had opinions about everything, including who his children dated. And those opinions usually didn't match reality. She said her older brother Stephen had been engaged twice, and Lawrence Whitmore had driven away both fiancés by making their lives miserable. I told her I could handle difficult parents, and she looked at me with something like pity. She said I probably couldn't, but she loved me anyway, so we might as well get it over with. That's when I learned her last name was Whitmore, as in Whitmore Development Corporation, one of the largest real estate development firms on the East Coast. Her father's company had built half the luxury high-rises and shopping centers in 3 states. The Whitmore estate sat on 40 acres outside the city with gates that required a security code to open. I drove my 10-year-old truck up a driveway that curved through landscaped gardens and past a fountain that probably cost more than I'd made in the past 5 years. The house itself looked like something from a European architectural magazine, all stone and glass with wings extending in multiple directions. Simone squeezed my hand as we walked to the front door and told me not to let her father intimidate me, that his bark was worse than his bite. I would learn that was completely wrong. Lawrence Whitmore's bite was significantly worse than his bark, surgical and precise and designed to destroy. He answered the door himself, despite presumably having staff, and I understood immediately that this was a power move, that he wanted to establish control from the first moment. He was 60, with silver hair and a handshake that lasted 3 seconds too long, his eyes evaluating me like I was a property he was considering buying and finding substandard. Dinner was in a formal dining room with actual place cards designating where everyone should sit. Simone's mother, Constance, was pleasant in a distant way, asking polite questions about my family and nodding at my answers without really listening. Stephen was there with his new girlfriend, Melissa, who worked in marketing for the family company. He kept giving me these sympathetic looks across the table like he knew what was coming. Lawrence dominated the conversation, talking about recent development projects and business acquisitions, throwing around numbers that made my annual salary look like pocket change. Then he turned his attention to me and asked about my career trajectory. I explained I'd worked construction since college, starting as a laborer and working my way up to project manager, that I was planning to get my contractor's license next year. Lawrence nodded slowly and said that was a nice hobby, but asked what I planned to do for real income. I felt Simone's hand tighten on her fork next to me. I told Lawrence construction was my career, not a hobby, that project managers made decent money, and I was good at what I did. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and said decent was a relative term, that Simone was accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and I should consider whether I could provide that. Constance made a small noise of protest, but Lawrence ignored her. He said his daughter had a trust fund that would activate when she turned 30, that she had a job at a design firm he'd arranged, that she drove a car he'd paid for, and lived in an apartment he owned. He asked what I could offer that would match what she already had. Simone spoke before I could answer, her voice tight with anger. She told her father I wasn't a business proposal to evaluate, that she loved me, and that should be enough. Lawrence set down his wine glass carefully and said, love was a luxury afforded by financial security, and without security, it turned into resentment. He'd seen it happen countless times. Stephen made eye contact with me across the table and shook his head slightly, a warning I didn't fully understand yet. The dinner ended early when Simone stood up abruptly and said we were leaving. Lawrence called after her that she was being dramatic, that he was simply being realistic about her future. Simone didn't respond, just walked to the front door with me following. In my truck driving back to the city, She apologized for her father's behavior and said he'd been like that her entire life, controlling and calculating and convinced money was the only thing that mattered. I asked if he'd been that direct with her brother's fiancées, and she said yes, that both women had eventually left Stephen because Lawrence made every family gathering unbearable. He'd questioned their careers, their families, their education, their goals, slowly picking apart their self-worth until they couldn't stand being around him anymore. Stephen had blamed the women for giving up, but Simone said she blamed her father for being a controlling asshole. She said she wasn't going to let him chase me away like he'd done to the others. I told her I wasn't that easy to scare off, which in retrospect was naive arrogance. The interference started subtly. Simone would mention plans we'd made, and her father would suddenly need her at the office for some urgent matter. She worked as a designer for a firm that did high-end residential projects, but Lawrence would call claiming he needed her expertise on one of his developments. These summons always seemed to coincide with our dates or weekend plans. When Simone pushed back, Lawrence would remind her that her apartment lease was coming up for renewal, and he'd been thinking about selling that building. The implied threat was clear: cooperate or lose your housing. Simone started lying to her father about our plans, telling him she had work obligations when really we were together. She hated the deception, but said it was the only way to have any autonomy. I suggested she move in with me to escape his control over her housing, but she said that would make things worse, that he'd see it as me taking her away and escalate his interference. 3 months after that disastrous dinner, I got a call from an unknown number. The man identified himself as Eugene Marsh, senior partner at Whitmore Development Corporation. He said Lawrence had mentioned I was a project manager and asked if I'd be interested in interviewing for a position with their company. The salary he quoted was triple what I currently made, with benefits and bonuses that would put me in a completely different tax bracket. I asked what the position entailed, and Eugene said they were expanding their residential construction division and needed experienced managers who understood quality building. It sounded perfect, except for the obvious problem: working for Simone's father. I told Eugene I'd think about it and call him back. I didn't mention the offer to Simone immediately because I wanted to understand what Lawrence was actually trying to accomplish. A week later, Eugene called again and said the offer had an expiration date, that they needed to fill the position soon, and Lawrence had specifically recommended me. I told Simone about the job offer that night over dinner at my apartment. Her face went completely still, and she set down her fork carefully. She asked if I'd applied or expressed interest, and I said no, that I'd been approached out of nowhere. She said her father was trying to buy me, that he'd done the same thing with Stephen's first fiancée by offering her brother a job at the company. The woman had felt obligated to make the relationship work because her family was benefiting from the Whitmore connection, and the pressure had destroyed the engagement. Simone said if I took the job, Lawrence would own me. He'd control my income, my career prospects, my schedule, and he'd use all of it to manipulate both of us. She said I should turn it down immediately and not engage with any further offers. I agreed and called Eugene the next morning to decline. He sounded disappointed but unsurprised, and said the offer would remain open if I changed my mind. I got the feeling he'd been through this script before. Lawrence called me directly 3 days later. I was on a job site reviewing foundation work when my phone rang with an unlisted number. His voice was cordial, but I could hear the steel underneath it. He said he'd heard I declined the position at his company and wanted to understand why. I told him I was happy with my current job and didn't think working for my girlfriend's father was appropriate. Lawrence laughed and said inappropriate was an interesting word choice, that most people would call it an opportunity. He said I was making a mistake turning down that kind of money, that Simone deserved someone who could provide for her properly, and my current salary barely qualified as providing. I told him Simone and I were both adults with careers and we were fine. He said fine wasn't good enough for his daughter, that she'd been raised with certain expectations, and I was setting her up for disappointment. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. If I really cared about Simone, I'd step aside and let her find someone on her level, someone who wouldn't hold her back. I told Simone about her father's call, and she went pale with fury. She said Lawrence had crossed a line by contacting me directly, that he was trying to undermine my confidence and make me doubt our relationship. She called him immediately, and I could hear her yelling from across my living room. She told him to stay away from me, to stop interfering, to accept that she was an adult, making her own choices. Lawrence's response was calm and cold, according to what Simone told me after. He said she was making choices with her heart instead of her head. And when this relationship inevitably failed, she'd understand he'd been trying to protect her. Simone hung up and threw her phone across the room. She said she was done trying to maintain peace with her father, that he'd proven he cared more about control than her happiness. I held her while she cried angry tears and promised we'd get through whatever he threw at us next. I genuinely believed we could handle it, that love and determination would be enough against his manipulation. Lawrence's next move was more aggressive. Simone's apartment building was suddenly sold to a development group that planned to gut renovate and convert it to luxury condos. All current tenants received 90-day eviction notices. Simone's lease wasn't up for another 6 months, but the new owners said they were exercising a buyout clause that gave them the right to terminate leases early with proper compensation. Simone called her father's office and got Eugene Marsh instead of Lawrence. Eugene confirmed that Whitmore Development had brokered the sale, but insisted Lawrence had no knowledge of Simone's tenancy in that specific building. It was technically plausible since Lawrence owned dozens of properties, but Simone knew it was intentional. Her father was making her housing unstable to pressure her into either moving back home or ending our relationship. Simone started apartment hunting, but everything in her price range was either too far from her job or in neighborhoods that weren't safe. I suggested again that she move in with me, but she hesitated, saying she didn't want to take that step because her father forced it. While Simone dealt with housing instability, I started noticing problems at my own job. Small things at first. Materials orders getting delayed, subcontractors canceling suddenly, permit approvals taking longer than normal. Then bigger issues. A major client pulled out of a project I was managing, citing concerns about timeline reliability. My boss called me into his office looking concerned and asked if there was something going on I needed to tell him about. I said no, that I'd been having unusual problems, but couldn't explain them. He said the client who'd pulled out had specifically mentioned hearing concerns about my management capabilities from someone in the industry, someone with influence. He asked if I'd had conflicts with anyone, and I immediately thought of Lawrence Whitmore. My boss knew the Whitmore name and his expression changed. He said he couldn't prove anything but suggested I be careful, that people like Lawrence had long reaches and subtle ways of destroying careers. I left that meeting feeling sick, realizing Lawrence wasn't just trying to break up me and Simone, he was trying to ruin my professional reputation. Simone moved in with me in October because she ran out of other options. Her apartment eviction deadline arrived and she couldn't find anything suitable in time. She brought 3 suitcases and looked devastated, saying this wasn't how she wanted us to move in together, that it should have been a choice, not a necessity. I told her it was still a choice, that she could have moved back with her parents. And she'd chosen me instead. That seemed to help a little. We spent the weekend rearranging my small apartment to fit both our stuff, and by Sunday evening it started feeling like our place instead of mine. Simone's mother called that night and begged her to reconsider, saying she could stay in her old room at the estate until she found a proper apartment. Simone asked if Lawrence had put her up to the call, and Constance admitted he'd suggested she reach out. Simone said that was her answer then, and hung up. She told me her mother had always been her father's accomplice, enabling his control by pretending to be the sympathetic parent while ultimately supporting his decisions. Work got worse in November. A project I'd been managing for 8 months suddenly had permit issues that halted construction. The city inspector said there were problems with the foundation specifications that should have been caught earlier. I pulled all my documentation and proved the specs had been approved months ago and nothing had changed. The inspector looked uncomfortable and said someone had filed an anonymous complaint claiming the foundation work was substandard and possibly dangerous. The complaint triggered a mandatory review that would take weeks and cost the client thousands in delays. My boss was understanding, but I could see him losing confidence in me. 2 other project managers weren't having these kinds of problems. I was the only one facing constant obstacles and delays. I started documenting everything obsessively, keeping detailed records of every approval, every inspection, every communication, building a paper trail in case I needed to prove I wasn't incompetent. Simone's job situation changed suddenly in December. Her boss called her into a meeting and explained that the firm had lost several major clients recently and needed to make budget cuts. Simone was being laid off along with 2 other junior designers. Her boss seemed genuinely sorry, but said the decision came from above, from the managing partners who controlled the finances. Simone cleaned out her desk in shock, carrying a box of her design samples and personal items to my truck. In the parking lot, she opened her laptop and started searching for her boss's managing partners. It took 10 minutes to find the connection. One of the managing partners had recently joined the board of a Whitmore Development subsidiary. Simone started laughing in a way that sounded slightly unhinged. She said her father was systematically dismantling her life, removing her financial independence piece by piece to force her back under his control. She said she'd never seen him this aggressive with Stephen's relationships, that he must view me as a particularly serious threat. That night, Simone called her father for the first time in months. I sat next to her on our couch and could hear Lawrence's voice through the phone, smooth and satisfied. He asked if she was ready to come home now that she'd experienced what life was like without family support. Simone's hand was shaking, but her voice stayed steady. She told Lawrence she knew he'd orchestrated her job loss, and probably my work problems too. He didn't deny it, just said sometimes reality needed a little push to make itself clear. He said she was welcome to come home anytime, that her room was waiting, and he could make one phone call to get her job back. All she had to do was end this relationship with someone so clearly beneath her station. Simone asked what happened to him. When did he become someone who'd hurt his own daughter to get his way? Lawrence said he wasn't hurting her. He was protecting her from making a mistake that would limit her entire future. Simone told him she'd rather have no future than one he controlled, and hung up. Then she cried for an hour while I held her. The financial pressure intensified after that call. Simone couldn't find design work because Lawrence had apparently spread word that she was unreliable and difficult to work with. Firms that had previously been interested suddenly weren't hiring. She started taking freelance projects, but the income was unpredictable. My work situation stabilized slightly after I documented everything and presented it to my boss, showing the pattern of targeted interference. My boss believed me, but said there wasn't much he could do about someone like Lawrence Whitmore. He suggested I look for work outside the region where Lawrence's influence wouldn't reach. I told him I couldn't leave because of Simone, and he looked at me with sympathy and said I needed to decide what I was willing to sacrifice for this relationship. The implication was clear. Staying with Simone meant my career would never recover as long as her father was against us. Stephen reached out to Simone in January, asking to meet for coffee. Simone was suspicious, but agreed, and she asked me to come with her. Stephen showed up looking uncomfortable and got straight to the point. He said Lawrence had asked him to talk to Simone to make her understand she was being unrealistic. Stephen said he'd agreed to the meeting but not to deliver that message. Instead, he wanted to warn Simone that their father was planning something bigger. Lawrence had been meeting with lawyers and financial advisors, reviewing Simone's trust fund documentation and the conditions attached to her inheritance. Stephen had overheard parts of conversations, and it sounded like Lawrence was looking for ways to revoke or delay her access to the trust money. Simone went very still and asked if that was even possible. Stephen said the trust had been set up with certain provisions, and if Lawrence could prove Simone was making financially irresponsible decisions, he might be able to petition for oversight or delay disbursement. Stephen said he didn't agree with what their father was doing, but wanted Simone to be prepared. Simone thanked Stephen for the warning and asked why he was helping her when he'd never stood up to Lawrence before. Stephen looked ashamed and said watching their father destroy her life had finally made him see how toxic the family dynamic was. He said he'd let Lawrence drive away both his fiancées because it was easier than fighting, but now he saw he'd chosen money and family approval over his own happiness. He said Simone was braver than him for walking away from all of it. After Stephen left, Simone looked at me with this expression of grim determination. She said her trust fund was supposed to be hers at 30, that it came from her grandmother who died when Simone was 15. The fund was worth close to $3 million and represented the only financial independence she had outside her father's control. If Lawrence found a way to block her access to it, she'd have nothing except her freelance income and me. She said she needed to talk to a lawyer to understand what Lawrence could actually do. The lawyer Simone consulted was expensive but knowledgeable about trust law. She reviewed the documentation and explained that Lawrence had significant control as the trustee until Simone turned 30. The trust specified that funds would be released at 30 unless the trustee determined the beneficiary was making decisions that endangered their financial well-being. That provision was meant to protect against things like addiction or gambling, but Lawrence could potentially argue that Simone's relationship with me represented financial irresponsibility because I couldn't support her at the level she was accustomed to. The lawyer said it would be difficult for Lawrence to make that argument stick, but he could tie up the trust in court challenges that would delay access and cost Simone legal fees she couldn't afford. The lawyer suggested Simone might want to consider reconciling with her father, at least superficially, until she secured access to the trust. Simone thanked the lawyer and walked out without scheduling a follow-up appointment. On the drive home, Simone was quiet for a long time before saying she had a decision to make. She could pretend to break up with me, repair her relationship with her father, get access to her trust fund at 30, and then leave and find me again. Or she could stay with me now, risk losing the trust money, and build a life with whatever we could earn ourselves. She said option 1 was smarter financially, but it felt like betraying everything she believed in. Option 2 meant giving up $3 million and facing years of financial struggle, but at least she'd be living honestly. She asked what I thought she should do, and I told her I couldn't make that decision for her, that $3 million was life-changing money, and I'd understand if she chose to secure it. She said that was a very diplomatic answer and asked what I actually wanted. I told her the truth. I wanted her to stay with me, but I didn't want her to resent me later for costing her that money. She nodded and said she needed time to think. The week Simone spent thinking was the longest of my life. She'd come home from freelance meetings and barely talk, just sit on the couch staring at nothing. I tried to give her space while also being available if she wanted to discuss it. My own thoughts were selfish. I didn't want to lose her, but I also couldn't stand the idea of her sacrificing millions of dollars for me. If she stayed and we struggled financially, would she always wonder what her life could have been? If she left and secured the money, would she actually come back? Or would her father convince her during those 2 years to stay away from me? The uncertainty was torture. Finally, on a cold evening in late January, Simone sat down across from me at our small kitchen table and said she'd made her decision. She was staying with me and accepting that she might lose the trust fund. She said the money would be nice, but it wasn't worth spending years lying and pretending. She'd rather build something real with me than inherit money tied to her father's control. I asked if she was sure, and she said no, she wasn't sure, that she might wake up at 35 struggling to pay bills and regret this choice completely. But uncertainty was better than the guaranteed misery of living under her father's thumb for 2 more years. She said she'd watched him control every aspect of her life since childhood, and she was done giving him that power. The trust fund would be nice, but freedom was better. I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling overwhelmed by her choice and terrified of the responsibility. She was giving up financial security for me, and I needed to make sure that wasn't a mistake. We sat there for a while, not saying much, just holding hands across the table and acknowledging that we'd chosen a harder path, but at least we'd chosen it together. That night felt like a beginning and an ending simultaneously, the death of one version of Simone's life and the birth of something new and uncertain. Lawrence found out about Simone's decision within days because Stephen must have told him. Lawrence called Simone's phone at 7 in the morning on a Sunday, waking both of us up. Simone put him on speaker so I could hear. His voice was ice cold and precise. He said he'd heard she'd made her choice, and he wanted to give her one final opportunity to reconsider. He said if she continued this relationship with me, he would exercise his rights as trustee to block her access to the trust fund indefinitely. He would also remove her as a beneficiary from his will and cut her off completely from family resources. She would get nothing from him, not now and not later, and she'd spend the rest of her life regretting choosing poverty over family. He paused and waited for her response. Simone looked at me, and I could see her taking a breath, steadying herself. Then she told her father she didn't regret it, that he could keep his money and his threats. She said she'd rather have nothing and be free than have everything and be owned. Lawrence was quiet for a long moment before saying she'd come crawling back within a year. Simone said she wouldn't, and hung up. The finality of that phone call hit Simone hard over the next few days. She'd known intellectually that choosing me meant losing her family's support, but hearing her father actually threaten complete financial cutoff made it real. She'd grown up wealthy with every advantage money could provide, and now she was living in a tiny apartment with uncertain income and no safety net. I watched her grieve the loss of her old life, even as she committed to this new one. She'd cry sometimes at random moments, like when she saw an expensive purse she used to buy without thinking, or when she couldn't afford to go out to dinner with her old design school friends. I felt guilty every time, knowing I was the reason she'd lost all that. She'd tell me to stop blaming myself, that she'd made her choice with clear eyes, but I could see the adjustment was harder than she'd expected. Money had always been invisible to her, and now its absence was everywhere. Work became my obsession because I needed to prove I could support us both. I took every extra shift available and started bidding for side projects I could manage on weekends. My boss noticed my increased dedication and stopped worrying that I was the problem with the delayed projects. In fact, once Simone had officially broken with her father, the mysterious obstacles at work disappeared. Permits started processing normally, clients stopped canceling, subcontractors showed up when scheduled. The pattern was obvious. Lawrence had been sabotaging me to pressure Simone, and now that she'd made her choice, he'd withdrawn his interference. Maybe he thought I'd fail on my own without his active involvement, or maybe he'd simply moved on to other priorities. Either way, my career stabilized, and I started making progress again. I got my contractor's license in March, and my boss offered me a raise and more responsibility. The money still wasn't close to what Simone had given up, but it was enough to cover our expenses and start saving. Simone's freelance design work picked up in the spring. Without her father's interference, firms started hiring her for projects. She built a portfolio website and started getting referrals from satisfied clients. The income was still inconsistent but growing, and I could see her confidence returning. She'd come home excited about a new project or a difficult client who'd loved her work. She started talking about maybe opening her own design firm someday, being her own boss instead of working for people who could fire her on her father's whim. I encouraged that dream, even though startup capital would be hard to find. She said she wasn't afraid of hard anymore, that choosing me had taught her she was stronger than she'd thought. I wanted to believe that, but I also saw the moments when she'd check her bank balance and wince, or when she'd skip buying something she needed because we couldn't afford it. The adjustment from wealth to working class wasn't glamorous or easy, and I worried constantly that eventually she'd regret it. We got married in September at the courthouse with 2 friends as witnesses. We talked about a wedding, but Simone said she didn't want anything her father could have paid for or attended. She wore a dress she'd bought on sale, and I wore a suit I'd owned for years, and the ceremony took 12 minutes. Afterward, we had lunch at a diner, and our friends gave us a card with a gift certificate for a weekend at a bed and breakfast. It was simple and perfect, and nothing like the elaborate wedding Simone probably could have had if she'd stayed in her father's good graces. When I said as much, she told me she'd attended enough society weddings to know they were more about display than actual commitment. She said our courthouse marriage meant more because we'd chosen each other despite everything working against us. I wanted to believe her, but part of me wondered if she was rationalizing, making peace with what she couldn't have, instead of genuinely preferring it. Constance reached out to Simone in October, asking to meet privately. Simone was hesitant but agreed, and she met her mother at a cafe while I waited in the parking lot. Constance apparently cried and begged Simone to reconcile with Lawrence, saying he missed her and regretted the harsh words. Simone asked if he'd actually said that, or if Constance was interpreting his silence as regret. Constance admitted Lawrence hadn't explicitly apologized, but she believed he would give in time. Simone said she wasn't interested in waiting for an apology that would probably never come. She asked if Constance was happy living under Lawrence's control, having every decision filtered through his approval. Constance looked uncomfortable and said marriage was about compromise. Simone said compromise required both parties giving something up, and she'd never seen her father compromise on anything. Constance left crying, and Simone came back to my truck looking drained. She said seeing her mother made her sad but also relieved, confirming that she'd made the right choice walking away. Stephen called in December saying he'd gotten engaged again, this time to someone named Paige, who worked as a pediatric nurse. He said he'd learned from past mistakes and hadn't told Lawrence about Paige until they'd been dating for a year and were already engaged. He'd kept the relationship completely separate from family involvement, and now Lawrence couldn't interfere without being obviously cruel. Stephen invited Simone to meet Paige, and Simone agreed, bringing me along. Paige was warm and down to earth, nothing like the wealthy socialite Stephen had dated before. She told us she'd heard about Simone's situation and respected her courage. Stephen said watching Simone stand up to Lawrence had inspired him to stop letting their father control his relationships. He said he was happy in a way he'd never been in his previous engagements, and he credited Simone's example for giving him permission to choose differently. After that dinner, Simone seemed lighter somehow, like seeing her brother break free from their father's control validated her own choice. We bought a small house in February, using a first-time buyer program and all our savings for the down payment. The house needed work, but had good bones, and was in a neighborhood we could afford. Simone threw herself into designing our renovations, and I handled the construction work on weekends. We painted walls and refinished floors, and slowly transformed the rundown house into something beautiful. Simone's design skills made our budget stretch further, finding creative solutions that looked expensive but weren't. She took photos of the transformation and posted them on her portfolio website, and those photos attracted higher-paying clients who wanted similar results. Her business grew steadily, and by summer she had more work than she could handle alone. She hired an assistant and started turning down projects that didn't interest her. I watched her build something real and independent, and the pride in her eyes when she showed me her business accounts was worth more than any trust fund. I started my own contracting company in August, moving from project manager to business owner. It was risky and stressful, but my former boss supported the transition and sent clients my way. Simone helped with branding and website design, and we worked together on several projects where her interior design complemented my construction work. We became a team professionally as well as personally, and the collaboration strengthened our relationship in unexpected ways. We'd stay up late working on proposals or debating design choices, and those nights felt more intimate than traditional date nights. We were building something together that was entirely ours, untainted by her family's money or influence. When clients complimented our work, Simone would beam with pride, and I knew she felt satisfaction she'd never found in her old job, where her father's name opened doors she hadn't earned. Simone turned 30 in November, and the trust fund officially became accessible under the original terms. She called the trust administrator to inquire about the status, and was told Lawrence had filed a petition to block disbursement citing financial irresponsibility. The petition was scheduled for a hearing in January, and Simone would need to appear with legal representation. She hired a lawyer who specialized in trust disputes and prepared to fight. The lawyer said Lawrence's case was weak, that Simone had managed her finances responsibly since leaving home and had built a successful business. Living modestly wasn't grounds for declaring someone financially irresponsible, but the lawyer warned that Lawrence could drag out the proceedings for months or years, costing Simone legal fees that would eat into the trust value even if she eventually won. Simone asked if it was worth fighting for, and the lawyer said that was personal decision, that $3 million was worth fighting for by most measures, but the emotional cost might outweigh the financial benefit. Simone spent a week considering whether to fight for the trust money. Part of her wanted to prove to her father that he couldn't control her even from a distance, that she deserved what her grandmother had left her. Another part of her was exhausted by the ongoing battle and wanted to just move forward without looking back. She talked to Stephen, who encouraged her to fight, saying Lawrence would respect the legal challenge even if he wouldn't respect her choices. She talked to her therapist, who pointed out that the trust represented a connection to her grandmother that had nothing to do with Lawrence, and Simone might regret walking away from that legacy. Finally, she decided to proceed with the hearing, not because she needed the money at this point, but because giving up felt like letting her father win. She wanted to show him that his threats and manipulation hadn't broken her, that she was still standing and fighting for what was rightfully hers. The trust hearing in January was in a wood-paneled courtroom with a judge who looked bored by the whole proceeding. Lawrence attended with two expensive lawyers who presented arguments that Simone had made reckless decisions by choosing a working-class partner over family stability. They claimed her business was unstable and her housing situation precarious, that she'd gone from living in a luxury apartment to a modest house that needed extensive repairs. Simone's lawyer countered with financial records showing her business was profitable and growing, that she'd purchased her house outright without parental assistance, that she paid her bills on time and maintained good credit. The lawyer presented testimonials from clients praising her work and business acumen. Lawrence's lawyers argued that Simone's grandmother would have wanted her to maintain the lifestyle she'd been raised with, not to struggle unnecessarily. The judge looked skeptical of that argument and asked if there was any documentation of the grandmother's wishes beyond the trust terms themselves. When the lawyers couldn't provide any, the judge moved toward ruling. The judge ruled that Lawrence had failed to demonstrate financial irresponsibility sufficient to block trust disbursement. Simone had proven she managed her finances capably despite choosing a modest lifestyle. The judge ordered the trust funds released to Simone within 30 days and assigned court costs to Lawrence for bringing a frivolous petition. Lawrence stood up immediately and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Simone. His lawyers scrambled to follow him. Simone sat very still for a moment before her lawyer touched her arm and congratulated her. Outside the courthouse, Simone broke down crying, and I held her while she shook. She said she couldn't believe she'd actually won, that some part of her had expected her father to prevail like he always did. She said the money was important, but the victory meant more, proof that she'd been right to walk away and that she could stand up to him and survive. The trust money arrived in Simone's account in February. $3 million transformed our financial situation overnight, but Simone was careful about how we used it. She didn't want to suddenly return to the lifestyle she'd left, didn't want to prove her father right that she'd only been able to survive without him by eventually accessing family money. She paid off our mortgage and set aside funds for business expansion, invested a portion for retirement, and donated a significant amount to organizations that helped young people escape controlling families. She kept our daily life largely the same, saying she'd learned to value things her money couldn't buy and didn't want to lose that perspective. We still lived in our small house and drove our old cars and cooked dinner most nights instead of going out. The security of having money in the bank was wonderful, but Simone said what mattered more was knowing she'd earned that security by standing up for herself. Lawrence tried to reach out once after losing the trust battle. He sent a letter to our house saying he'd been harsh and wanted to discuss rebuilding their relationship. The letter was formal and contained no actual apology, just a vague suggestion that they could move past their disagreement. Simone read it twice and then put it through the shredder. She said her father hadn't changed, he'd just lost control and was trying a different manipulation tactic. She said if he genuinely wanted reconciliation, he'd start with an actual apology acknowledging what he'd done wrong. A generic letter about moving forward wasn't enough. I asked if she thought she'd ever want a relationship with him again, and she said maybe when she was older and felt more secure, but not now, not when she was still building the life he'd tried to destroy. She said some relationships were too toxic to maintain, and choosing herself over family obligation was the healthiest decision she'd ever made. Constance continued trying to arrange meetings between Simone and Lawrence, always acting as intermediary and suggesting that Simone just needed to give her father more time. Simone eventually told her mother that she was welcome to maintain a relationship with Simone independently, but Simone wouldn't discuss Lawrence or accept pressure to reconcile. Constance seemed unable to separate herself from her husband's agenda, and the relationship grew increasingly distant. Simone said it was sad but predictable that her mother had spent 40 years defining herself through Lawrence's expectations and didn't know how to exist independently. Stephen maintained his relationship with Simone and kept her updated on family developments. He married Paige in a small ceremony that Lawrence attended but didn't dominate, and Stephen said standing up to their father had improved their relationship by establishing clear boundaries. He told Simone that watching her walk away had given him permission to stop accepting unacceptable behavior, and he was grateful, even though he'd initially thought she was making a mistake. We had our first child in March, a son we named Adrian. Simone's parents found out through mutual connections, and Constance sent a massive flower arrangement to the hospital. The card said she hoped to meet her grandson someday and included a phone number if Simone wanted to talk. Simone sent a thank you note but didn't call. She said her children would grow up knowing they had grandparents on her side who'd chosen control over connection. And that would be sad, but honest. She didn't want to expose Adrian to Lawrence's manipulation or teach him that family obligation mattered more than self-respect. I supported her decision, even though part of me wondered if she'd regret it later. She said she'd rather regret protecting her son from a toxic grandfather than regret exposing him to harm. When Adrian was old enough to ask, she'd explain that sometimes families can't be safe, and walking away is an act of strength, not weakness. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.